And now I invite Crystal Amos to come forward to light the chalice and lead us in our affirmation of covenant.
I light the chalice with these words. Open your eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. And open our hearts to love one another. Now, if you will please join me in saying our affirmation of affirmation of covenant, which is found in your order of service. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
At the beginning of this month, I told you the story of how the First Unitarian Universalist Church of New Orleans was born of a split within First Presbyterian Church of New Orleans, when, having accused their Congregationalist minister Theodore Clapp of unorthodox preaching, the stalwart Presbyterians left to start over, while Clapp remained to serve the remnant who stayed and thus became the first minister of a new, more liberal church. He became the minister of that Presbyterian church in the first place because the Congregationalist and Presbyterian denominations had agreed to cooperate in planting churches in the American Southwest, that is, in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. But the local Presbyterians became increasingly uncomfortable with that agreement, and by the 1830s, opposed it. Presbyterians like to fight. It's a bad habit they picked up from Calvin. In the United States, especially in their missions on the settler colonialist frontier, they have a long tradition of supporting education and an equally long tradition of wrestling with the theological impact of education. The wrestling continues today. For example, only 10 years ago, the Presbyterian Church USA reached a modern milestone in its embrace of human diversity. As the Huffington Post then reported, following years of debate and introspection, America's largest Presbyterian denomination has announced a change to its constitution that allows for a more inclusive definition of marriage. The new wording in the denomination's Book of Order will describe marriage as being between two persons. About 71% of the PCUSA leaders approved of the change during a General Assembly meeting the previous summer. The church had been waiting for a majority of its 172 presbyteries or regional bodies to approve the measure one by one. A majority was reached with 86 presbyteries handing in decisions to support same-sex marriage within the church. At that time, my friend, the Reverend Dr. Margaret Amer, professor at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, wrote this. Some things to remember about that vote. First, any pastor can refuse to marry any couple. That hasn't changed and isn't going to change. Second, any session, that is, the governing board of any Presbyterian congregation, can refuse to have a wedding ceremony in its sanctuary. That hasn't changed and isn't going to change. What has changed is that pastors who, in the course of their pastoral duties, decide that it is pastorally appropriate to conduct the marriage ceremony of two persons may do so in jurisdictions where such ceremonies are legal, and at that time already that included most states. They will not be in violation of the Constitution of the Church because it will read between two persons, not between a man and a woman. Similarly, sessions who choose to open the church sanctuary for such a service will not be in violation of the Constitution of the Church. The vote, she said, was not "you shall." The vote was "you may." That "you may" is something that many Presbyterians worked toward for a very long time. The PCUSA already recognized what they called more light congregations, those who seek to provide a welcoming and supportive religious home for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, just as our Unitarian Universalist Association recognizes welcoming congregations committed to the same goal. The name they use, more light, derives from the famous line spoken by the Reverend John Robinson in his sermon to the pilgrims who were about to leave Europe on the Mayflower. "The Lord hath more truth and light yet to break forth from his holy word." You see, he was saying that the interpretation, not the book, was what mattered. John Robinson and the Pilgrims, of course, were forebears of the Congregationalists, so you can see how the attachment and tension between the Congregationalists and Presbyterians runs deep. As in Louisiana, the beginnings of Universalist and Unitarian churches in Arkansas were entwined with the activities of Presbyterian frontier missions. The first Presbyterian missionary in Arkansas arrived in 1828, and in that year organized First Presbyterian Church in Little Rock, when the city consisted of 19 families. At its start, the church had 7 members. The Reverend James Wilson Moore, called the father of Presbyterianism in Arkansas, remained the only Presbyterian minister in Arkansas for 4 years after that. But after a slave revolt in Virginia in 1831, known to history as Nat Turner's Rebellion, Presbyterians in the southern states got very interested in establishing themselves in the Arkansas Territory. Other clergy soon arrived to help organize churches and colleges in existing communities here. In 1833, the Reverend Daniel Gray led a group of colonists from Mississippi up to what's now Jackson County in northeastern Arkansas. By 1835, there were enough Presbyterian churches to organize the Arkansas Presbytery. The next year, Reverend A.A. Banks came from South Carolina and organized a church at Spring Hill. And a year after that, the National Presbyterian Church split over the issue of slavery. I feel sure it wasn't his fault. More Arkansas churches were organized in the early 1840s. Another colony, this time from North Carolina, arrived at Mount Holly in 1843. And by 1852, a second presbytery was organized for the southern half of the state, called the Presbytery of Ouachita. And 3 years later, the General Assembly of the Southern Presbyterian Church created the Synod of Arkansas from the western portion of the Synod of Memphis. All this momentum was lost during the Civil War. In 1863, the Synod, which usually met in Little Rock, met in Washington, Arkansas. You know who was organized there. And it didn't meet again until after the war, when it only met every other year. The annual Synod meetings resumed in the 1870s. The denomination struggled to rebuild and resume its growth until the turn of the 20th century. And just about then, in 1895 to be precise, The Reverend Quillen Shin, a Universalist evangelist, came to Little Rock and organized a successful Universalist church and helped raise the funds to pay its first minister, the Reverend Frederick Carrier, who arrived in 1902. He was succeeded 2 years later by the Reverend Athaliah Irwin, the first woman ordained by any denomination in Arkansas. She stayed 4 years, during which the church built its own building. Both Carrier and Irwin, by the way, later served the Universalist congregation in Riverside, California, where I served in the early 2000s. So I've known about them for a minute. In 1908, the church hired the Reverend George Cunningham, who also stayed about 4 years, and got very involved in Little Rock civic affairs, keeping the still small congregation in the news. Then, in 1912, he was succeeded by the Reverend Henry Clay Ledyard, who was equally active in civic affairs and also kept the church in the news because he was an outspoken socialist. Ledyard left late in 1915 as World War I raged in Europe and the United States was still trying to stay out of it. The Universalist congregation did not call a new minister, declined during the years of the war, the flu pandemic, and the Red Scare. And in 1920, at the height of the Red Scare, the church sold its building and closed. Where did those Universalists go? According to an Arkansas Democrat Gazette Other Days feature published last month, the following item appeared in one of our local papers on December 1st, 1924. For the man who believes that God inflicts eternal punishment for sins committed in this life, God cannot be an example to follow. According to the Reverend Hay Watson Smith, pastor of, are you ready? The Second Presbyterian Church, who declared in a sermon to a large congregation last night that the old-fashioned conception of hell is not compatible with the character of a just God. He maintained that he believes in the Bible, that he considers it the greatest book in the world, but that he does not believe in eternal punishment. They went to Second Presbyterian Church, that's where. Like Theodore Clapp, but 90 years later and 400 miles north, Hay Watson Smith, a Congregationalist, came from the Northeast to serve a Presbyterian church in the South. He arrived right around the time that the Little Rock Universalist Church brought in that socialist. In the Presbyterian system, a church can't bring in a new minister without the presbytery also approving. When Smith appeared before the Arkansas Presbytery, he clearly stated his disagreements with the Presbyterians' Westminster Confession, and the presbytery admitted him with full knowledge of those. According to Central Arkansas Library System's Encyclopedia of Arkansas, Smith had studied at the conservative Union Theological Seminary in Virginia, but did not stay long. Ill health and doubts as to whether he'd chosen the right profession caused him to withdraw from the school. After teaching in South Carolina schools for 2 years, Smith returned to Union in 1893 and graduated in 1897. He did postgraduate work at my alma mater, Union Theological Seminary in New York. His first ministerial appointment was as pastor at the Parkdale Congregational Church in Brookline, New York. From 1906 to 1909, he pastored First Congregational Church in Port Chester, New York, and then served for a year as president of the Selma Military Institute in Alabama. And then on February of 1911, he accepted a temporary assignment at Little Rock Second Presbyterian Church and was soon offered the position permanently. Applying to the Arkansas Presbytery for official credentials, He read a statement as to his acceptance of evolution, his inability to accept biblical inerrancy, and disagreements with parts of the Presbyterian Confession of Faith. He was accepted by the presbytery with only one dissenting vote. Smith's early years in Little Rock coincided with the publication in Chicago of a series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals. We derive the term fundamentalism from those pamphlets' title. Just as Clapp arrived at his church about a decade before the Presbyterian Church would split over slavery, so Smith arrived here about a decade before the modernist fundamentalist controversy threatened the unity of the Southern Presbyterian Church during the 1920s. Again, according to the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, the Southern Presbyterian Church had opposed Darwinian evolution since the 1880s, a stance that was reaffirmed in 1924. Smith opposed the denominational leadership, preaching 2 sermons in 1922 on the topic and concluding that evolution was indeed scientific truth, but that it posed no threat to Christianity. He published those sermons as a pamphlet, which was distributed widely. In the aftermath of the 1927 Scopes monkey trial, State Representative Astor L. Rottenberry of Pulaski County introduced a bill to prohibit the teaching in any state-funded educational institution of the theory that mankind ascended or descended from a lower order of animals. Smith preached a sermon the following Sunday attacking the proposed bill and calling Rottenberry and his colleagues uninformed men ignorant of all the evidence on which evolution is based, legislating against the intelligence of the world. For good measure, he also distributed a pamphlet on the widespread acceptance of evolution by eminent scientists, as well as former President Woodrow Wilson, a devout Southern Presbyterian. Smith testified against the bill before the House Committee on Education. When the state Senate later killed the bill, a coalition of conservative religious leaders immediately began a petition drive to refer the matter to a popular vote in the 1928 general election. Smith joined the committee formed to oppose it. Arkansas voters approved the proposed constitutional amendment, making Arkansas the only state in the nation to outlaw the teaching of evolution by popular referendum. During the campaign, Smith published a 23-page pamphlet titled Some Facts About Evolution, which not only attacked the proposed amendment, but also called out Presbyterian leaders for opposing evolution. He personally paid to distribute 3,000 copies of that pamphlet to Presbyterian clergymen throughout the South. As a result, the 1929 Presbyterian General Assembly, at the request of the Augusta Presbytery in Georgia, ordered the Arkansas Presbytery to investigate the orthodoxy of Smith's faith. The Arkansas Presbytery appointed a commission. It's what you do if you're a good Presbyterian, appoint a commission. And after a brief investigation, the commission decided that while Smith might not hold to all provisions of Presbyterian orthodoxy, he had stated his differences in 1912. When accepted into the Arkansas Presbytery, the commission voted 5-2 that Smith's beliefs did not affect the essential and necessary doctrines of the church. The Arkansas Presbytery, as well as the Arkansas Synod, approved the commission's report. The action of the commission did not put an end to the conflict. In 1931, the General Assembly approved an appeal to consider the propriety of the commission's report. Propriety. Smith responded with a blistering sermon on June 28, 1931, in which he concluded that the heresy of today is the orthodoxy of tomorrow. My kind of guy. Okay. The controversy raged for another 3 years. The Arkansas Presbytery, I told you Presbyterians like to fight. The Arkansas Presbytery and Synod consistently supported Smith. Ultimately, in 1934, the General Assembly heard the case again and sustained the action of the Presbyterian Synod in refusing to place Smith on trial for heresy. That's the difference 90 years made between Clapp and Smith. Now, in the middle of all that, the Reverend John Clarence Petrie, then serving First Unitarian Church in Memphis, came sniffing around Little Rock to see what prospects there were for organizing a Unitarian congregation here, and he concluded that as long as Hay Watson Smith was at Second Presbyterian, there was no hope of a self-sustaining Unitarian congregation. But during his visits, he did meet E.E. Cordry, a science professor at Arkansas State Teachers College in Conway, who later led the effort to found this congregation. Cordry, by the way, taught evolution in defiance of Arkansas state law. Okay, with that story in mind, let's listen again to Adrienne Marie Brown's words. When the teacup breaks, we see how that particular tea was never for us, leaving us the holy lessons of mindfulness, intention, deeper presence. Our temporary and cyclical work is to notice what is broken, clean up the dangerous fragments of the past, and let them go, or remake them into something beautiful, and then begin again. In the early 20th century, socialism was not for any institution that hoped to endure. American conservatives at all levels of government had stirred up too much public sentiment against it. From then until 1940, because Hay Watson Smith had attracted the Universalists and so many other religious liberals to Second Presbyterian Church, a separate Unitarian or Universalist church in Little Rock was not sustainable. Those teacups were broken. But religious liberalism did not die here. It found safe harbor with our neighbors. Today, we are a strong, self-sustaining Unitarian Universalist congregation. To whom might we pay forward our neighbors' generous support? In these times, we might well be called upon to harbor neighbors as oppressed today as our Universalist forebears were 100 years ago. Indeed, we already provide space for some of our neighbors at risk, the free thinkers, the queer collective, folks of pagan spirituality. And we might now be called on to do more. May our history inspire us to reach out, to gather in, to build bridges, whatever it takes to make a strong stand for the values of justice, equity, pluralism, interdependence, generosity, and transformation to which we are committed. So may it be. Amen.
I invite our chalice lighter, Crystal Amos, to come back forward to extinguish the chalice. And please join in saying our closed words, which are also printed in your order of service. Go out into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the suffering. Honor all beings.
And may we reach out, gather in, build bridges, endure, be curious, wonder, love, and be loved. Amen.